Good afternoon, New York, and the rest of our listeners around the globe. My name is June Stoyer, and I'm the host of the Organic View Radio Show. Our podcast is available on iTunes, Zune, and you can also visit our website at www.theorganicview.com. If you have any questions for our guests, there are many ways you can contact the show. You can post a question on our wall on Facebook, Skype us, send us a tweet on Twitter to @TheOrganicView, or you can contact me directly at June Stoyer. If you'd like to be on the show or would like to find out about sponsorship opportunities, please contact us at questions@theorganicview.com.
Today's topic, Lords of Nature, life in a land of great predators. What would happen if your car had no oil or the steering wheel had been removed or you had no more gas? Your car would not function properly, and clearly you would have problems driving. When it comes to nature, every plant, every creature, every micro and macro organism plays its part much in the same way. Human beings are notorious for quickly destroying wildlife for the simple reason being that these creatures are either difficult to cohabitate with or are just a nuisance. It's unfortunate that people are so disconnected with nature and do not see how each creature plays an important role that impacts other creatures, human beings included. Quote, leading scientists working around the globe are learning that these much-feared predators may in fact hold a key to life itself. It is the presence or the absence of top predators that affect the health of the entire ecosystem, end quote. And that's from Lords of Nature. The Lords of Nature, Life in a Land of Great Predators, is a captivating documentary which tells the story of how science is now discovering top carnivores as revitalizing forces of nature and of society now learning to tolerate beasts that they once had banished. So today I'm going to be talking to Karen Anspacher-Meyer, who is the Executive Director of Green Fire Productions, and also to Craig Miller. He's the Southwest Representative for Defenders of Wildlife. So good afternoon, Karen, and good afternoon, Craig, and welcome to the Organic View.
Thank you, June.
Thank you, June. It's great to be here.
I'd like to begin with Karen. Karen, can you tell our audience about yourself and how you got involved with working for Green Fire Productions?
Well, I'm one of those people that I actually put my college education into my career and profession. I'm doing what I studied in college, which is kind of rare sometimes. I started taking documentary courses at the University of California in San Diego and immediately fell in love with the medium and using images to convey information and found that it was a really persuasive medium, as we all know. And I remember in the first course that I had for documentary filmmaking, our professor said, now pick a subject that you're really interested in because you're going to work on this all term long. And so my main interests were conservation and the natural world. And so I connected with one of the local conservation groups and found out about what they were working on, and they were working to stop the damming of the last free-flowing river in Southern California. And so I did a short 10-minute documentary on that, and so that was in 1982, I think. And I've been doing that work ever since.
Wow. How many documentaries have you made since?
Let's see. I haven't counted them recently, but it's a couple of dozen. And,
wow, that's just tremendous.
Yeah, it's what we've found over the years. My husband and I then went on to found Green Fire Productions in 22 years ago as a way to produce documentaries and short format video programs that could be used as tools to advance conservation and social justice issues. And so we've been working with nonprofit organizations and Native American tribes and natural resource agencies over the past 2 decades to create compelling programs that speak to really important issues that often are not covered in the mainstream media and certainly aren't covered in the detail that we're able to do in our films.
Growing up, I used to love to watch Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. And I have to admit, watching Lords of Nature, it was bringing back memories, and all I thought to myself was, wow, these folks are like a modern-day version.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's, the natural world to me it's the most fascinating thing out there, and watching wildlife. And I just got back from time in the Florida Everglades in the national park, and we could sit there for hours and watch the birds and alligators, and it's just fascinating. So that's quite a compliment.
I have to say, the documentary had so much information, and the thing is that mainstream media does not cover any of these issues because basically it's not sexy enough. It's not something that's going to sell, so therefore they deem it not marketable. These are situations that are happening on our own land, and basically this is upsetting our own environment and our own existence. It was just very interesting how much I did not know watching this documentary, just the historical components to it. When you first began doing the research for the documentary, the people that are in the film, how did they feel about your work?
Well, it's interesting. I had read about Bill Ripple and Bob Beshta's work in a little blurb in National Geographic magazine, and we were doing a film on the Hells Canyon area forms the border between Oregon and Idaho, and the wolves were starting to come back into Oregon from Idaho, and there was a lot of question and concern about wolves coming back into Oregon, and I felt like there's got to be something more to this argument than just wolves impact prey, and that's why we need them in the ecosystem. I thought, why aren't people talking about the benefits? And so when I first read about the science and research that Bill Ripple and Bob Beshta did, it just, this light bulb went off, and it was like, of course there's ecological benefits to top predators like wolves and cougars being on the landscape. And so here was the science that was, the proof, essentially.
It's almost as if when they hear a scientist that says, yes, this is exactly what it's doing, then the light bulb goes off, and then people start to understand that this is a serious crisis.
Exactly, and I knew that their research and their story wasn't getting broad coverage. The only place I could learn more about it was either through talking to them or in reading the scientific journal articles that have been published. And I don't know how many people in the audience have tried to wade through a scientific journal article, but they're difficult, It's not easy reading. And so our goal really was to take that science and the complicated information and present it in a way that all of us could understand, because, in the end, it's very simple and very straightforward.
One of the things that I also admired was the fact that there was so much history involved. Was it very difficult to get all the facts and figures from, I guess, the different resources that you investigated?
Let's see. Well, I guess, a lot of that information has been documented, although Leopold actually did a lot of it himself, looking at the extermination of wolves and other predators. We heard a lot, just word of mouth, from people like Bruce Babbitt, the former Secretary of the Interior, who grew up on a ranch and remembered that history of exterminating predators in order to protect both livestock and elk and deer.
Can you talk about your background and what you're currently focused on right now?
Oh, thank you. I currently work with Defenders of Wildlife. It's a national wildlife conservation organization based in Washington, D.C. I'm in Tucson, Arizona, and I have led Defenders regional conservation programs focused on wolf and jaguar conservation since 1993. I'm also affiliated with a binational group known as the Northern Jaguar Project, working to conserve jaguars throughout their northern range with emphasis on recovery in the U.S.-Mexico border region. and I am a conservation fellow of a group called the Rewilding Institute, which is an entity which seeks to integrate traditional wildlife and wildlands conservation practices with modern conservation biology to advance landscape-scale conservation. And how did I get started? I've always worked and had an interest in the interface between humans and nature. Even as a child, I spent most of my time, outside of the city. And it's funny you mentioned Mutual of Omaha. I grew up in Omaha, and on the outskirts of Omaha. Spent quite a bit of time out in the forests and bluffs along the Missouri River, in an area where most of the rest of nature had been plowed and chained. And as a child, I learned nature is very logical. It makes a lot of sense, and there's a lot more going on than most people in modern society realize, and have always pursued that passion. In early college years, I was fortunate enough to get a job where I was taking people out doing things I love, backpacking and climbing and rafting, and also natural history interpretation, and just maximizing contact with nature and helping, learning more myself, but helping others, increase that familiarity. And later on, took that to another level and started integrating, active conservation into those trips, and got active in the wilderness movement in Arizona back in the late 80s. And at that time, one of my favorite areas to explore was what's now known as the Blue Range Primitive Area, or the Blue Range Wolf Recovery Area. And, on trips, I would have experiences there realizing that, this is supposed to be one of the wildest areas left in North America, and yet it isn't nearly as wild as it used to be, or as it could be, or as it should be. And I later learned that it was very near the site of Aldo Leopold's epiphany about sort of the wisdom of nature, that it's a much more complex system than people realize, and it's self-sustaining. And in fact, I just a few months ago backpacked down to the site of where Aldo Leopold and his buddies back in the early 1900s shot into a pack of wolves, then thinking that removing wolves from the landscape would create a hunter's paradise by increasing deer and elk populations.
And many people feel that way about different areas of the country, but that's not exactly the case.
No, in fact, it's astonishing that nearly 100 years later, people still hold on to that idea that predators are nothing but an inconvenience, and the best management approach is simply eradication, or in the case of wolves, extermination. Despite the decades of degradation of our national forests and our riparian areas and our aquatic systems and our grasslands and all of the species and interactions between those species that depend on the role of wolves, there's still a stronghold in our population that holds on to these old school beliefs that similar to the way people looked at Native Americans years ago. The only good wolf is a dead wolf. And unfortunately, in the last few years, there's been a resurgence of that interest and the political power reflected in that interest, particularly through our state wildlife agencies, which primarily reflect the interests of hunters and ranchers, at least in our western states. And that has led to a renewed effort to remove federal endangered species protections for wolves throughout their range in the West. And it's much more complicated than that, and I would love the opportunity to describe that at some point in the future. But the problem is those efforts are not at all informed by science. It's purely guided by either ignorance, fear, frustration, or a refusal to embrace science that's been collected over the last 75 years.
And can you just talk about exactly what have they found, and in regards to the Mexican wolf, what I guess the question that I'm trying to ask is, right now you're dealing with a crisis because there are only a handful of wolves left, and if they are wiped out, what is going to happen to that section of the country?
Well, with Mexican wolves, they are the rarest and most critically endangered land mammal in North America. They were completely eradicated from the United States back in the early 70s. In fact, in the late 1970s, the last 5 known Mexican wolves were live captured in Mexico and brought into captivity to prevent them from disappearing completely. That started a captive breeding program, which, coupled with the guidance of the Endangered Species Act, which emerged about the same time, led to a captive population sizable enough to support reintroductions. And Mexican wolves began being released back into the wild starting in 1998. And after 12 years of the program now, there are just 50 Mexican wolves coursing the landscape in the American Southwest. That's about half of what biologists had hoped for at the onset of reintroduction. And one of the reasons for the low numbers is very high rates of illegal mortality, just outright, some people call it poaching, but it's more criminal than that. It is intentional, an intentional effort to shoot, trap, or poison, or just run over a wolf at the opportunity, to sabotage the effort. And then that's in part, reflecting the mentality of the last century, which still, unfortunately, governs much of our wildlife and natural resource management in the West. And unfortunately, those interests have made their way into Congress, and recently even our state agency, the Arizona Game and Fish Department, has requested removal of the endangered species protections for Mexican wolves.
Oh, of course they have, because obviously, certain people have friends in the right places. It's like with anything else that seems to be going on. I remember growing up in the Catskills, we had a major crisis with tent caterpillars. And I remember they were everywhere, and they were basically gobbling all the leaves on all the trees, and it was a major, major problem. And all because some genius decided that they were going to bring these creatures into this part of New York because of some other predator that there was an issue with, or I think that's how it went. And the thing is that it's still today, it's still a major problem. And it just never ceases to amaze me how people that have a specific agenda, they do all sorts of mayhem because they have a particular goal in mind, not realizing that this is going to affect so many people and just so much of the environment. It's really criminal.
Right, and as Karen did such a good job of documenting, it's about much more than just wolves. It's about all of the relationships that wolves are responsible for in rebalancing nature. And in our part of the world, we've suffered this. Our natural systems have declined significantly. It's lowered the carrying capacity, which ultimately impoverishes human communities. And it is an interdependent relationship. But
I wanted to.
So often.
Go ahead, Craig.
So often the motivation behind sabotaging, programs like Mexican wolf restoration are based on fear and ignorance, or fear of loss of control, or fear of new information. And unfortunately, we're really losing a lot as a society. I mean, beyond just wolves and the symbolic reinstatement of wildness to the landscape, or at least to what's left of our wild areas, and the ecological benefits that come with wolves, which hopefully we'll be able to talk a little more in a little more detail about. There are also dozens of other benefits that come with wolves, ranging from economics. I mean, looking at studies in and around the Yellowstone ecoregion, wolves are responsible for about $35+ million a year net income in form of tourism, people coming out to possibly see wolves or track them, and costs associated or inputs associated with lodging and buying gas, and restaurants, that sort of thing. And our rural communities need that kind of input. So it's a shame that people are unable to see the net benefits of wolves, in addition to all the ecosystem services like clean water and helping to reduce the effects of overgrazing and promoting the genetic vigor of native prey. All of those net benefits are potentially jeopardized by, the fear and ignorance and resistance of a very vocal minority.
One of the things that we've encouraged our guests to do in the past is, when I've had other folks from Defenders of Wildlife on the show, we've encouraged them to actually contact the local Department of Tourism to complain and say, something, if I'm going to take my family to your state to visit, I'd like to make sure that there's some wolves that I can still see, or whatever the case may be. And that's actually a pretty interesting way to go about getting their attention. But, it's so many people just really have no idea.
Right.
Oh, I just wanted to add that, Craig's talking about the ignorance and lack of understanding about the ecological role of top predators. I mean, that was the whole goal behind producing Lords of Nature, was to tell that story. And so I just wanted to take a few minutes maybe to share with the viewers who haven't seen the film and who aren't familiar with how this chain reaction ends up working, to run through that briefly, if that sounds all right.
Sure, that'd be great.
Yeah, so, when we started looking at what are the benefits that these top predators, and, as Craig mentioned, it's cougars and wolves, bears, even sharks in the ocean, have to play this kind of a role in the ecosystem. And so the scientists that we were following, they are from Oregon State University, and their first work was in Yellowstone National Park. And what they found is that when wolves are present, that aspen, cottonwood, and willow along the stream banks and other areas were healthy and growing, and that without the wolves, in places like Yellowstone, they were losing their aspen and cottonwood and willows, because the elk, basically, which are the prime prey for wolves up there, were essentially eating to their heart's content. They could just stand along a stream side. They didn't have any predators to be afraid of, and they ate everything down to little nubs. And so while the aspen and cottonwood and willow were growing, they just got eaten faster than they could grow. And at first you're like, okay, well, they're just trees and plants. What does that matter? But the big thing that they found is that, the trees provide the habitat and the food for this whole host of wildlife. And so in Yellowstone, they had this kind of perfect experiment, because we had killed wolves off. I think they killed the last one in 1926, and then we brought them back in 1995 and 96. And so the scientists were able then to look at what changes started happening in the ecosystem with the wolves back in place. And so then they started finding places where the willow is growing and the aspen and the cottonwood are growing. And then on top of that, there's 12 more beaver colonies than there have been in decades, and songbirds that people hadn't seen who, were showing up in large numbers along the stream banks where the willows were. The fish populations were doing better, and, they went on and did work in other national parks throughout the West with other top predators, and they found the same kind of effects taking place. So it's amazing, in Zion National Park, in areas where there were a lot of cougar living, they had, vastly greater numbers of butterflies and wildflowers and frogs and toads and fish. So they really, not only do they restore the landscape, but they provide that habitat for, a whole variety of wildlife, all the biodiversity to thrive.
Yeah, and that's very, very important, especially since for a while there, and correct me if I'm mistaken, for a while there, everything started looking very barren.
Oh, yeah, when you have an area where the elk and, the other deer and whatnot are allowed to just go and eat to their heart's content, the landscape changes.
What was the public's response to that? There had to have been someone out there that said, something, this is ridiculous. The landscape is so barren. It's so depleted of resources. Did the public have any particular type of reaction?
Well, back,
because I would think that that the property values would have gone down also.
Well, Craig can speak maybe more to areas outside of parks. I focused more on the research that was done inside the national parks.
Okay.
In Yellowstone, they realized early on, they had these massive herds of elk that grew up after the wolves were exterminated, and they went to they took it to the point of actually culling the elk and killing the elk herds to try and reduce their numbers. And even though they reduced their numbers dramatically, they still had that same impact of they weren't on the move. They didn't have wolves roaming throughout the valleys and riparian areas, keeping elk wary and moving them from spot to spot so that they couldn't just eat everything.
Now, Craig, I have a question for you. Why is it that human beings have such a fearful relationship of wolves?
A pathological hatred, as Barry Lopez calls it. I think there are many factors. A big part of it is, the competition for domestic livestock. When we became agrarian societies, wolves became direct competitors with humans, and caused a hardship in taking livestock. And particularly in the American West and Southwest, when we brought settlers and by the thousands, along with our domestic animals, primarily cattle, and we had very large mining camps with thousands of men, and they would subsistence hunt, which would suppress native prey populations of deer and elk and javelina and pronghorn. And in fact, our native elk, Merriam's elk from Arizona and New Mexico, was hunted into extinction in the early 1900s, just as an example of how we reduced the native prey population. But that was the source of food for wolves, and we largely replaced the native prey with larger, slower-moving livestock. And, of course, wolves would turn to the larger and slower-moving cows, which created even more of a hardship for people, trying to adjust to an arid, Southwest environment. And, folks couldn't do much about the drought. They didn't know much about the impacts of unmanaged livestock grazing, but they could certainly do something about the wolves, and they attacked wolves with a vengeance. First with a private trapping and poisoning initiative, and then later it became a federal program complete with bounties, and that's really what wiped them out. But that was fueled by that pathological hatred, which is the combination of, this direct competition for livestock and centuries of myths and misinformation, ranging from Little Red Riding Hood to, the Three Little Pigs to, dozens of children's fables that characterize wolves as being these bloodthirsty villainous killers.
Now, on that note, I just want to interject something. Has the current, the current trend, if you will, with werewolves had any positive impact on your work, especially with the whole Twilight series, because of the love of Team Jacob, if you will? I would think that you would have millions of teenage girls that are going gaga over anything to do with wolves and basically would be in complete support of everything to do to protect them.
Karen, this one's all yours. I haven't had a television in 25 years, so I don't know how to respond to that.
I actually am in touch with some filmmakers that are doing a documentary that is going to kind of tear off of the Twilight movies and is looking at the Olympic area and the need to bring wolves back there. So I think they're trying to do exactly that, to tie into that, really amazing popular culture support for werewolves and transfer that over to wolves.
All I'd like to say is, Taylor Lautner, if you're listening, please, by all means, get in touch with Karen or with Craig, because they could really use your support. And I'm pretty confident that if he came on board, Team Jacob would definitely save the day.
That's what we need.
I could add something on a slightly different cultural aspect, and that is the White Mountain Apache tribe. I know not quite the Twilight series, but in recent years there's been renewed interest among the White Mountain Apache, particularly younger tribal members, in embracing the return of Mexican wolves, because wolves played an important part in Apache culture through their songs and stories and prayers. And what's interesting is, with the return of Mexican wolves, there seems to be a resurgence among Apache in relearning, particularly younger tribal members, in relearning some of the traditions that involved wolves and other wildlife. And the tribe itself has 1.6 million acres, which is a tremendous amount of wild, intact, excellent wolf habitat adjacent to the current wolf recovery area. And frankly, the tribe's positional wolves will either make that 1.6 million acres a gauntlet or a gateway to recovery, and really determine the future of wolves in the Southwest. And to that end, we have partnered with the White Mountain Apache tribe to create a non-consumptive, meaning non-hunting, wildlife tourism program that creates opportunities for tribal members to engage in the wolf program and other wildlife programs as tour guides, and tracking and natural history interpretation, and incorporates cultural components, including crown dances and a sweat lodge ceremony and traditional handicrafts, craft work such as bead making, cradle boards, that sort of thing. And Karen and Rolf with Greenfire Productions produced a fantastic 5-minute overview video for us and for the White Mountain Apache tribe to help the tribe get this program off the ground. And the first ever tours will take place this June. And it's really a fantastic opportunity to support wolf restoration for one of the rarest, most critically endangered animals in the world, and support the Apache tribe in doing the right thing to help the wolves and to help tribal members, connect with nature in a very positive way. But I encourage listeners to take a look at our website. It's www.defenders.org/Apache Wolf. That's one word. And you can view the video that Karen and Ralph produced. And again, it's super fantastic. And I'm really grateful, Karen, that you were willing to step up to the plate and help us with that. And I hope your listeners take advantage too. It's really a neat, time-sensitive opportunity to help do the right thing on many fronts. So.
Thank you, Craig. And I have a question for you. In regards to these Mexican wolves, is it even possible to take some of the cubs and bring them to another region and to try to repopulate their numbers?
Well, that's all part of the recovery strategy. And unfortunately for Mexican wolves, they have not had a final recovery plan that included recovery goals. The most recent approved version is from 1982, and it did not establish population goals. It called for reestablishing a minimum of 100 wolves in the wild as a start towards recovery. But what you just described is an essential component of achieving recovery. And the new recovery team just met for the first time last week after a 6-year hiatus. And they will discuss the latest science on population viability and issues like ecological effectiveness. It's basically trying to put measurables on the very phenomenon that Karen described, the ecological effect of wolves in the wild. How do we achieve ecologically self-sustaining populations? And does that require multiple populations across the landscape with intermittent connectivity, meaning allowing wolves to exchange genes or find mates from other populations intermittently to keep the populations robust and viable. So all those issues will be dealt with through this recovery team, hopefully using the latest science, and that action you just described will be necessary to establish additional populations in the wild. We know that you will need at least multiple populations, a minimum of 3. We're looking at 5 areas in southwestern United States and northern Mexico that remain capable of hosting small populations of Mexican wolves. But to reestablish those populations, it would require translocations or releases of either captive Mexican wolves or wolves that have been adapting and surviving in the wild in the current recovery area.
It's an option that, if it can be explored, should be explored, because it's just really sad that so many people just have no respect for wildlife and the things that you're dealing with. It's just really heinous. What would you like to see happen, especially with our elected officials? Have they been responsive?
The most important thing that a person could do right now to protect wolves is to speak out, because wolves aren't able to your senators, because the most recent continuing resolution just passed by the House has provisions to strip endangered species protections from gray wolves. And the problem with this is goes far beyond just gray wolves in the northern Rockies. It sets a horrible precedent for how endangered species in this country are managed. It would set, and in fact, it sets such a bad precedent that we expect to see dozens of other similar types of bills in the near future that strip endangered species protection from any animal that poses some form of conflict or disagreement among key constituencies of certain decision makers. For example, right after these, a couple of the new gray wolf bills were introduced in the House, Don Young from Alaska introduced a bill to strip endangered species protections from polar bears, and it's just the first step. And it passed the House. Right now, it's really up to the Senate to step up to the plate and stop this. And the only way that's going to happen is if people contact their senators. We've tried to make it very easy. On the first page of Defender's website, www.defenders.org, it's very easy to contact your senator. We've got the very first thing you'll see is an option to block the Senate's anti-wildlife bill, urging your senators to oppose efforts to pass anti-wildlife attacks in the continuing resolution. And we've got the timing down, but we need people to step up to the plate and contact your members of Congress, in particular senators, to shut this down while we have the opportunity.
Now, it's almost as if the USA has become what we've accused China of being for many years. I spent a month in China, and I was a little horrified at some of the things that go on over there, but we're no better, or that's the way that we're heading down that road. I mean, the fact that we would take these necessary laws away protecting these creatures, it's almost as if, what are they going to do next? Are they just going to annihilate every living creature in America?
Well, that's one thing we're doing with Lords of Nature right now. Craig mentioned the effort to contact senators, and we're doing the same thing with trying to get, working to get Lords of Nature DVDs to the supportive and neutral senators in Congress, so that they and their staff have an opportunity to get some more sane information and scientifically based information to make their decisions on. And so anyone who wants to help us out with that as well can go to the lordsofnature.org website and help support the efforts to get the DVDs to the senators.
And thank you. And June, to your question, fortunately, we are different than China in that we are a representative democracy. Unfortunately, democracy is not a spectator sport. You have to get up and play. And right now it's essential that for those of us who have an ecological awareness and compassion for other forms of life, we have the ability to express those concerns and influence policy that protects those interests. So now's the time. We need to take advantage of decision-making tools that we're given. Again, you can do so on our website, defenders.org, first page. It's pretty time-sensitive and pretty important.
How much time do you have left, Craig?
Pardon me?
How much time is left before they make a decision?
That's a fair question, because the problem with this is that the wolf legislation has been wrapped into the continuing resolution, which you all are probably aware is a must-pass continuing resolution to keep the government funded. Now, there's an effort to extend that through a temporary funding mechanism. I think it gives another 2 weeks, if I'm not mistaken. But there's not much time, and the problem is none of this has gone to open debate. It's all been kind of wrapped into the rush of this emergency, continuation of federal spending bill.
Oh, how convenient.
So, yeah, unfortunately, that's politics. The definition of politics, right?
Well, it's actually taking away our freedoms because this is up to us, not for some politicians that were elected by us to abuse the positions of power that they're in, to just do something because they have a particular special interest group that is financing their campaign to get a particular agenda across.
Right.
In essence, it is our right as Americans to have these freedoms and to have these animals here because they are part of not only our environment and our culture, but our history, our past history, and our future.
Right. Well, it's much. I mean, the wolf is always symbolic of much more, and in this case, there's much more going on than just endangered species protections for wolves. But it symbolizes a much more extreme and far-reaching attack on the environment, one of the worst in recent memory, that would not only eliminate key components of the Endangered Species Act, but it seriously undermines prospects for wildlife throughout North America and undermines key protections by gutting the Clean Water Act and the Environmental Protection Agency and the Clean Air Act. And again, the problem is it's all being shrouded in this continuing resolution, which is not allowing any of these issues to be aired in the light of public debate and discourse.
Have there been any other organizations that have reached out and offered to help work with you to really bring light to all of the things that are going on?
Oh, there are dozens of organizations concerned about this and working in various capacities. The value of Defenders is that we're based in Washington, D.C. and able to keep a fairly close pulse read on this legislation, what's happening. But we do work very closely with other organizations ranging from National Wildlife Federation to Natural Resource Defense Council to the Center for Biological Diversity. And but as you're probably well aware, there are hundreds of other issues wrapped up in this continuing resolution that are of concern to the public, ranging from funding for national public radio to hundreds of other programs important to people's hearts. And what we're concerned about is that the critters that can't speak for themselves may lose in this debate.
Well, it seems as though when it comes to anything to do with nature, it's usually the first thing that's cut when it comes to any budget, and that's just common knowledge. And this is just even more proof that once again it's like an afterthought until there is some type of catastrophe where it affects other industries and it takes away from their bottom line, and then they say, "Oh, well, we shouldn't have done."
Right.
Now, my next question is for Karen. Karen, one of the things that I'd like to ask you is, as you were creating this documentary, what was the biggest thing that struck you as you were, filming the different locations and just working with the different people? What was, I guess, the main thing that struck you?
Well, I guess it really changed the way that I look at nature and how nature works. I didn't understand this cascading effect that the top predators would have, and to see with your own eyes, to be out there in the field with the researchers and look at the plants that have been eaten down by the elk, and then in the areas where they've been able to thrive, and you can see signs of wolf all around there. And that was really stunning. I mean, I came away with a totally different understanding of how nature works. And for someone who's worked on conservation issues for all of my career, that's a lot when something totally changes your kind of world view.
Go ahead.
Well, there was one other component to this that kind of counterbalances this loud voice that's out there from livestock producers and ranchers that are upset about having wolves and angry and don't want them around. There's a quiet, I'm not sure if they're a majority or not, but there's a lot of them who have actually learned to live with wolves. And so we interviewed folks in Minnesota who live with 3,000 wolves around them in the wolf territory in Minnesota. And, they raise their cattle, they raise their sheep, and they do it without killing wolves. They use non-lethal approaches to reducing conflicts between wolves and their livestock. And that was really impressive to see that, we do have the capacity to do it. These folks have done it. I talked to the largest sheep ranchers in Idaho who are using these non-lethal approaches, and they, instead of losing dozens of sheep in a grazing season, they lost one or two, and they didn't have to kill wolves to do it. And so that was this kind of hopeful part of the story that's important to tell for the rest of us to know, it can be done. We can successfully coexist with top predators. We don't have to kill them.
Now, speaking of a worldwide, I guess a global approach, if you will, how has the film been received in other parts of the world?
Oh, well, that's interesting. Very similarly to how it's been received in the United States. We had a number of screenings take place in South Africa with young students who were living in areas where they have, lots of top predators that they're dealing with, and they're raising livestock there as well. And so they learned a lot through the film. It's been shown, in hundreds and hundreds of communities across the country. We partnered with more than 100 NGOs nationwide and around the world that we provide them a step-by-step screening guide so that they can host public screenings in their communities. And, people come away having learned a lot. We have panel discussions following the film, and so the organizers bring in local experts so that people can learn about how this relates to them where they live. And so it's proven both a really strong educational experience, emotionally engaging and moving, and then as well, the key thing is motivating people to take action and make their voices heard to the decision makers that are deciding how we manage these wildlife populations.
Have you had any response from people outside the United States that have said, what's going on over there?
I can comment on that because I work closely with an effort to restore Mexican wolves and jaguars in Sonora, just south of the border in Mexico. And some of my colleagues have viewed the Lords of Nature movie and really want a Spanish version so that they can share it with groups of ranchers with whom they're working to prepare for wolf reintroduction. And particularly, of particular interest is what Karen mentioned about these coexistence practices that many and more ranchers are starting to adopt. The use of fladry, or this portable electric fencing that's used to separate sheep, to herd sheep and keep them separated from predators to reduce predator opportunity, and increasing human presence during sensitive times of the year, like during calving, by providing riders to assist ranchers with the extra labor, or purchasing alternate allotments or pastures to help create a secure calving area near an area where wolves may be denning, that sort of thing. These are ideas that work, and more ranchers north of the border are taking them on. And ranchers south of the border are very interested in getting a jump start on some of these collaborative, solutions-oriented approaches. So, they've been warmly receptive of the Lords of Nature film, and in fact, there's a demand worldwide for this type of positive problem-solving messages in the interface between carnivores and humans.
Yeah, it's nice to hear that they're interested in what's been going on, because from what I understand, and that has not been the case, people have not been so cooperative. What do you think is going to be the fate of the Mexican wolf in the near future? Do you think that it is very hopeful that you can save this creature?
I'm very optimistic. I wouldn't be here if I weren't. It's been a long, hard road, and we have a long ways to go. But the good news is wolves are doing their part. We've got working with 5th and 6th generation captive animals at the beginning of the reintroduction program, and no one was sure if they had retained the instincts or behaviors necessary to survive in the wild, but fortunately they have. They've been able to identify and kill native prey successfully and establish territories and find mates and reproduce and largely avoid conflicts with humans other than, those direct, intentional, illegal shootings. Politically, like I said earlier, democracy is a participatory sport. We've got to continue to educate and motivate the public to act on behalf of wolves and other similar species and all they represent, because it's the right thing to do. It opens the door to collaboration between a variety of human communities, and it restores essential ecological balance, and it provides opportunities for economic prosperity and the opportunities to educate ourselves and learn more and more about the complex system upon which we all depend. Any way you look at it, it is the right thing to do. So because of that, it will succeed. It's not going to be easy, but it'll work.
That is, it's great to hear that there is so much optimism, and I sincerely hope that the next time I speak to you, you've made some great strides. Could you just tell our audience, other than reaching out to their Senate, their local senators, how else can they get involved? What would you advise, say, school children or any college kids that are out there that could potentially get involved and do some fundraising or, get involved with your organization?
Well, I think that the easiest way to do that is, and I hate to just send folks to a website, but it's really well done. And we've got some opportunities for a variety of different age groups and a wide range of skills, ranging from giving presentations to your school. We have a site set up specifically for teachers called kidsplanet.org. It's a Defenders-run site that has curriculum on the importance of predators and visuals and wolf boxes that we can send, wolf kits that have tracks and skulls and teaching materials and lesson plans and that sort of thing. We have meetups regionally in most states where groups of Defenders members and supporters get together to get involved in a variety of ways, from letter writing to getting out to helping some of the ranchers trying to do the right thing, string up flattery, or provide extra eyes and ears on the ground during sensitive times of the year. From my admittedly skewed perspective, the most exciting thing someone could do right now is come on out and join us on one of these Apache eco tours. And please contact me if you're interested. There's only 10 spots available for 2 trips this June, but that opens the door to dozens of other opportunities for direct and indirect involvement. I give you an unforgettable perspective on the program, particularly an interesting tribal perspective, but it, again, can help point someone in the right direction if they really want to bump their level of activism and have a good time doing it. But again, defenders.org, there you'll see a couple of tags. One of them is called Take Action. There's another one called What You Can Do, or if you want to just contact me, I can help figure out what your skills are and where what your interests are and where you would best fit into the effort. Don't hesitate to get in touch.
Thank you. And if they wanted to get in touch with you directly, could they also reach you through the defenders.org site?
Certainly. You could just, my name is Craig Miller. There's a little search engine right there on the front screen, or my address is cmiller@defenders.org, defenders.org. And I'm honored to speak with anyone about this. So thanks.
And folks, if you're listening, please get in touch with him.
Everyone, we are out of time, but thank you so much for tuning in. And if you've missed the show, you can always subscribe to The Organic View on iTunes or visit our podcast archives at www.theorganicview.com. Have a great day, everyone.